Right. So I want to talk about the role of phosphorus and what we gain from chronosequence studies today. And first of all, just want to highlight why phosphorus is so important in terms of determining ecosystem productivity. It's because alongside nitrogen, it's the least available nutrient in the system. And if you look at the quantities of phosphorus that's available either in aquatic or in terrestrial systems in the soil solution relative to what the plants actually need, it's about a ratio of about 80,000 for phosphorus and 30,000 for nitrogen, and other nutrients are much less. So that means that when we look at managed ecosystems or agricultural horticulture systems, in order to increase production, we have to put fertilizer in. And the reason for the target for putting fertilizer in is really what I term the agronomic optimum, which is what we really need when we put fertilizer in is to achieve a level of phosphorus status, which is given here as the Olsen P status. It's a level of phosphorus in the soil that can attain somewhere between 75 and 90% of maximum production. And part of that is given that there's a whole lot of other things that affect the productivity. So aim for 75 to 90%. And that's what drives the increase in production that's evident on the slide on the left here, which where after the Second World War you can see that the massive increase in the amount of phosphorus mined and used, almost mainly for fertilizer, and that is to supply food for an expanding population. So that's how the food production has been increased by using a lot of phosphorus fertilizer in the last 70 odd years. But there is a bit of a downside to this. There's a couple of downsides, really. One is that a lot of the phosphorus that's actually applied is not actually used by the plant in the growing season that when it's applied. Um, and this diagram gives some data for a period of 40 odd years across the world. But if you look at the bars on the far left of the diagram, you can see there that the inputs of phosphorus, about 550, relative to the outputs in terms of what the plants take up, is less than half. So what we've got is, if you look at a phosphorus use efficiency of an average across the globe, it's very different in different parts of the world, but of about 45%. What that means is that 55%, over half of the fertilizer phosphorus that's put into soil, is actually accumulating, and that's what we call legacy soil phosphorus. Now that happens because the phosphorus is actually being, it's mainly water soluble phosphorus, enters the soil solution, and it gets absorbed on mainly iron and aluminium oxides. And so it's stabilized there. So that's one issue, that very low phosphorus use efficiency. Another thing relates to something I'm going to talk about a little bit later, is that expansion in phosphate rock use after the Second World War, up until about 2007, 2008, the actual cost of the raw material and the fertilizers that were produced from it were relatively stable. And actually, phosphorus was fairly cheap. And in some parts of the world, large areas of North America, Europe, and parts of the emerging economies like China and Brazil, there was a tendency to actually put more phosphorus in to sort of beyond that agronomic optimum that I talked about, try to get that extra 10% and put more phosphorus in, and to overcome that barrier. But in doing that, economically, it's viable. It was viable, but the problem is that if you push it up, as the higher the phosphorus status, the higher the risk of phosphorus loss or transfer to water environment, to environments, um, to aquatic environments, and therefore accelerated eutrophication, so damage. Now, what I want to talk about is, I'll come back to why did we look at chronosequences. Well, chronosequences are basically sequences of soil that develop over time. They develop from a raw parent material and look over time. And the thing about chronosequences is that we can look at, essentially there's very little or no phosphorus coming into the system. The phosphorus is all there at the start, and as that soil develops, so we can get a real good insight into some of those processes that are actually reducing what we see, that phosphorus use efficiency. And one of the most studied chronosequences is actually on the west coast of the South Island and Southwestland at the Franz Josef Glacier. And in the 1960s, they discovered that down the valley in front of the glacier, that the glacial valley, sorry, that over the course of what was thought originally 20,000 years, but actually subsequently been redated to 120,000 years, that glacier has come down that valley and retreated over a period of time. And the further, there are a number of deposits, the further away from the glacier, the older the deposit. And obviously something that's right at the face of the glacier, when the ice melts, it leaves behind the rocks and the ground up rock and rock particle and rock fragments. So we have a sequence of soils ranging from basically 0 to 120,000 years. And what happens is that there's phosphorus in the parent material. So that we have a phosphorus availability at the start. We don't have any nitrogen. There's no nitrogen in the parent material, but bacteria can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So they fix nitrogen, and as that fixation of nitrogen with the phosphorus allows the plants to establish, and we get a forest established, and we move through a period of we go away from nitrogen deficiency. We have a period of nitrogen and phosphorus sufficiency. But what happens is we're losing phosphorus all the time, and actually mainly to drainage. And what happens is that with time, we start to slip into a phosphorus deficient situation, and what we call the retrogressive situation. So you can see those pictures on the top right hand corner. And what happens in that situation, you can represent this in a diagram form. And this is actually not just for Franz Josef. This has been shown for a whole lot of chronosequences across the world. That initially, we have the first point to notice about this diagram is the amount of total phosphorus in the soil actually declines with time. And that is partly due to phosphorus going into plant biomass, but also mainly due to plants phosphorus being lost in drainage. And what happens is that primary phosphorus, it's calcium phosphorus, it's actually relatively soluble. It can meet plant needs. But what happens is that you get weathering and you get iron and aluminium oxides forming in the soil, and they absorb this inorganic phosphorus. And initially, what's called a non-occluded fraction. Now, that phosphorus is in equilibrium with the soil solution, so it can come back into the soil solution to supply plants. So it acts as a supply, as a sort of to supply ongoing plants. But what happens is that phosphorus changes over time to being not available. It's basically tied up, and what the terminology that's used here is occluded. So that explains, partly gives a really good explanation of what happens in fertilized systems. But the other thing that happens here on the bottom here is organic phosphorus. That's phosphorus tied up with organic matter through biological processes. And that increases with time, and so the thing that I've been mostly involved in terms of most of my research has been looking at this role of the biological systems in terms of supplying the plants with phosphorus. And this is a very complicated diagram, but I'll try and explain it very briefly, very quickly. Basically, this is a model that we built up of the Franz Josef, 4 different points on the Franz Josef from early to very late. And we've basically got 5 soil pools, inorganic, organic, and also microbial phosphorus was held in bacteria and fungi mainly, and also the biomass, the green symbol there, the green rectangle, is biomass phosphorus, plant phosphorus. And what this illustrates is, if you look at this table here, organic phosphorus as a percentage of total soil phosphorus was less than 10% in the very early stages of the system, but it goes up to 40% in the later stages. Now that's actually consistent with what we see on this diagram. So the organic phosphorus becomes more important with time. And if we look at the microbial phosphorus, which is this phosphorus contained in bacteria and fungi, relative to the plant biomass phosphorus, in other words, phosphorus going into the trees, it's less than 20% early on, but it's 80%. So what this tells us is that the phosphorus in the latter stages of these chronosequences is actually being supplied mainly by biological processes as opposed to chemical processes. So we've got this information from these chronosequences that say the inorganic phosphorus is being tied up, but organic phosphorus is becoming more important and can actually sustain plant production, albeit at a lower level, plant growth, but it is able to sustain it. Now, Just to give you another example of that, we've studied a chronosequence further south at the Haast River, which is a coarse sand series of sand dunes laid down by alpine fault earthquakes mainly. And in these systems, um, this switch from inorganic to organic happens very, very quickly. It's coarse sand, it's higher rainfall, and it switches within a couple of 100 years. And this is a 6,500 year sequence, or 4,000 in this representation. It switches very, very quickly from chemical to biological, and it actually sustains it. And this system shows no sign of retrogression. Okay, it's a younger system, but it's a different system. And so that gives us more an insight into these organic processes, these biological processes can sustain plant growth. So what does that mean? Well, as well as coming back to the agricultural systems or the food production systems, I mentioned before that phosphorus was very cheap after the Second World War. Well, it was a real shock to the system around 2007, 2008. And this is the price, this is the very price of phosphate fertilizer since that period. And basically, this is phosphate rock, the bottom line here. And phosphate rock went from less than $50 a ton to over $400 a ton. And that affected the fertilizer price. These are the different fertilizers. And what's happened since that period is that the fertilizer price has maintained very high, but it's also become very, very volatile, very sensitive to a number of things, including, for example, at the end here, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what we've moved from a relatively stable, relatively inexpensive phosphorus supply system to a more expensive, much more volatile fertilizer supply system, phosphorus supply system. So that brings us back to what can we do to actually address, we've got all this legacy phosphorus, 50% of the phosphorus that we put on is still there. How can we possibly access that to reduce our dependence on this ongoing fertilizer inputs? And there is a lot of, going too fast there. There is a lot of, there is some insight that we can do. One of the things we can do in cropping systems, in arable crop systems, is that we can actually, there are plants that are there's a number of plant species that have been discovered that are very, very good at mobilizing this occluded phosphorus, this very stable inorganic phosphorus, and also some organic phosphorus as well. And they do this, and the diagram here in the bottom left-hand corner shows this. This is the root on the left-hand side is a blue lupin, or lupin angustifolius. The other one is P. And then you can see that the very fine roots, and that's, we think, is the key to how these plants can actually mobilize that phosphorus. And the point about that is that these plants can mobilize it, but they're not crop plants in themselves. So what has to happen is that they get put in as what's called green manures or cover crops. Green manure is probably the better term. And what we do is we grow these plants in between food crops. So they're short-term crops. We don't let them get to maturity. We grow the plant. They mobilize this inorganic phosphorus. We incorporate it into the soil or lay it on the soil surface, and that breaks down and supplies phosphorus to the following crop. The other advantage of this system is that it stimulates biological activity because you're applying a lot of carbon, and we know that it does that. And the net result of that is that there's an increasing body of research that shows that this actually not only mobilizes legacy phosphorus, and it also stimulates biological phosphorus cycling, which can lead to getting the same production from less fertilizer. So in the long term, it's a way of mobilizing phosphorus, using less fertilizer. And my final slide is just really to come back to chronosequences again. I mentioned the Haast sequence, a lot of work on it, Franz Joseph, but we've actually done the Haast sequence in Southwestland is actually a series of sequences that we're working on, and we're mainly looking at this biological aspect of phosphorus supply. So we've got the Haast River here on the left hand side, this sequence, but we've actually got an identical sequence of chronosequences at different points down the coast. If you go 40 kilometers south, you go to Jackson's Bay, which is here, this photograph here, just on the right hand side. And there we see the same sequence, but it's in gravel. And we go another 30, 40 kilometers south to Big Bay, in the bottom right-hand corner here. And there's what we've got here is a fine sand. So we've got coarse sand at Hast, gravel at Arafota or Jackson's Bay, and we've got at Big Bay, we've got fine sand at one end of the bay and gravel at the other. So we've got different physical conditions, and that's giving us a real insight into not only the biological, but the interaction between the inorganic and the biological side of things in terms of supplying phosphorus. And these systems may not look very big, but the dunes are actually separated by swamps or by swales, and you can see there that it's an interesting environment to work on. Thank you.